Welcome to Kinship Cafe. I am your host, Jim Jones, and today I am joined with Ben Grace.
Great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Thanks so much for coming on today. And today we have an interesting topic. We're going to be talking about coming home to ourselves. Very excited about that. Just before we do, would you like to open us up with a song?
Sure.
Right on.
The rubber, their father and mother set out to discover over and under. My heart's all aflutter, the shake and the shudder and fear. Each mile traveled has come and unraveled in one long ramble of dust and gravel, a hell-bent tangle of hope and scandal and tears. Suddenly weightless, I'm aimless and losing my ground, now chasing fences and recklessly burning them down. And I found I can't turn around, I can't find a way back home. Three sheets and never the night that I met you set out to regret, and I swore I'd forget, but you loved me and tethered, you whispered forever will do. Spent that whole summer, whole smiles and stutters, out to discover over and under. Belong to each other, there ain't any other like you. Suddenly weightless, I'm aimless and losing my ground, out chasing fences and recklessly burning them down. And I found I can't turn around, I can't find a way back home. 'Cause you are the open road, you are the great unknown, you are the reason I'm lost but believing. They say you can't go back, baby, I'm fine with that. 'Cause what good would home do if I couldn't hold you? Suddenly weightless, I'm aimless but finding my ground, now chasing fences and recklessly burning them down. Suddenly weightless, I'm aimless but finding my ground, out chasing fences and recklessly burning them down. And I found I can't turn around, I can't find a way back home, can't find a way back home.
Ben, that was just beautiful. Is that an original piece?
Yeah, it's a newer one of mine, actually. I've been writing for years and years and years, but right now I'm actually in the middle of a real sort of writing spurt that's kind of unprecedented.
Nice.
In the last 2 months, I've written about 18 songs.
Wow.
So it's kind of been quite a forward movement of creativity.
And what's it called?
Can't Find a Way Back Home.
Say that again?
Can't Find a Way Back Home.
Oh, and well, this is very apropos then for our topic.
Yeah.
And why don't you tell us a little bit about what the song is about?
Yeah, I mean, it starts out the first couple of lines leaving father and mother and going out into the world. And so for me, it's very much about the journey which I think we're all on a little bit, where we actually leave home. You know, we at some point we'll all leave home, father and mother, to either move away or to find a relationship or to go away to college or to find a new adventure or find work. And so a lot of us do that physically, but I think for a lot of us who had spiritual upbringing, where had a background, we're actually finding ourselves moving away from that center at some point, or asking questions, or kind of discovering other things about the world. And I think with the internet the way it is nowadays, you know, once upon a time you used to just go down, to the middle of the town where you actually had all of the churches and the faith communities on those street corners. Now I think there's so many options for you to kind of go out into the world and to find those strands of meaning that we're looking for.
Yeah.
So whether it's faith or something else, it's about trying to find, in this case, in the song, it's kind of a relationship, it's a person. I think a lot of the themes underneath that, like the bridge when it says, "You are the open road, you're the great unknown, you are the reason I'm lost but believing." Like that we're all looking for something bigger, more meaningful in our lives. We're as humans, we're meaning-making machines looking around the world to make sense of this experience called life.
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, speaking of leaving home, you come to us with a bit of an accent.
Yes, I do.
So where are you from?
I'm from Sydney, Australia. I grew up there. I lived in Australia for 30 years of my life. Moved to the States in late 2011. I lived in New York for 7 years, and then since Memorial Day last year, 2018, I've been in 24 different states and 4 different countries. So
Wow.
I literally kind of took to the road and was essentially homeless for about a year.
Wow.
So I just found myself landed down in San Diego 2 months ago and calling this place home now, and kind of in a new season of my life.
Hey, well, we're glad to have you here.
Yeah.
So anything in particular kind of sparked that journey?
Yeah, a lot of it was just another stage of deconstruction, I think, for me. I grew up in a cult. That's kind of part of the story
Really?
that I had in my life. And so I think from the time I was 11, I think I had my first sort of deconstruction, or that first moment where I realized the questions that just kind of completely sort of kind of fell in around me. But for me, I just don't think it's been one kind of state of deconstruction. I think there's been signposts along the way where things just fall away. And I think when I moved to the States, that was another kind of thing where you sort of outside of your culture completely, experiencing that culture shock, which I didn't realize was a real thing. And kind of going to a place like New York, where it's an abrasive city full of beauty and amazing diversity, but really made me challenge a lot of things about myself. Definitely up close and personal with a lot of things on, kind of talking about social justice, just the diversity of that place around to race or sexual orientation. That place has everything you can think of, and people who are questioning all of those things. But then, a year ago, the community of faith that I founded there, I'd been there for 6 years, and my marriage kind of fell apart, and everything kind of just seemed to go, had a moment in my life where I felt like I had a Job moment where everything I touched kind of fell to dust. And I found myself kind of starting again, which is weird because it was like the eve of my, I'm turning 40 in a matter of months. And so it was this last year coming to out of my 30s where I was like, wow, I just don't know what I'm doing anymore. I felt like I really lost kind of that anchor of my life.
Well, you've definitely brought up a lot of things that I would be very interested to probe here. So maybe start with, you said you grew up in a cult. What was this?
Yeah, I grew up in a faith called the Christadelphians. I don't know if you've ever heard of them. There's only about 60,000 worldwide. And I grew up, I think for a lot of people they had a very different experience that I did, but I grew up on the real inside family, a family that was very influential, and found myself at the epicenter of this very, very conservative part of Christadelphia. So I've wandered since out in my 20s. I found my way out to a kind of more liberal and more progressive side of Christadelphia, but generally where I kind of grew up was extremely oppressive of women. It was one of those classic do not ask any questions whatsoever. If you strayed at all from kind of the orthodox belief, you had left the truth. They called it the truth. And so there's very much this pressure to conform, this pressure to fit in, and I identify on the Enneagram I'm a 3 with a pretty mighty 4 wing. Okay. And so I think this idea of trying to be yourself was just not valued. Yourself was only valued as much as the tribe. You could actually stay inside those boundaries and stay inside that experience. Like there was the idea of a self beyond that was kind of was something that people have never really talked about.
It wasn't really open.
No.
So how did they view other? So help me with the term again. What was the name of it?
Christadelphians.
Christadelphians.
Yeah.
So I'm assuming from the title that it's fitting in within somehow the Christian context?
It is.
Okay.
They're very proud of it not being mainstream Christians. They hold a bunch of divergent views. They're non-Trinitarian. one of the good things is they don't believe in a supernatural devil. So yet instead of actually putting that somewhere else, they put the devil inside here. So we're the devil, which I think was one of the views that I'm just unpacking now. It has become actually huge in part of this journey of finding my way back to myself, because I was always taught that this was bad, like horrid. So a bunch of very divergent beliefs. They were very proud of being kind of having the truth. They're very proud of being not mainstream Christian. They thought that most Christians were, had it wrong, but they particularly hated the Catholics. They were in the book of Revelation, as you're probably aware of, the whore of Babylon, the harlot, like that was the Catholic Church.
Okay.
So they were very anti-Catholic, but also very outspokenly against other Christians. It's almost kind of like, to me, there was the idea of the world, right, that I think a lot of communities of faith talk about, what we have and then what everyone else has. But I think there was kind of two layers of that in Christadelphians. There was like the Christadelphians, then there was the other churches, which also had it wrong and mostly were at war with the other churches. And then there was the people outside of that who we didn't honestly talk about all that much,
Mostly concerned about other Christians?
Yeah.
Maybe because they're like being false witnesses to the faith type of an idea?
Yeah, that's right.
Yeah. Yeah, it reminds me a bit of a book. Can't remember when it came out. I think it might have been in the 50s, The Two Babylons, that I think it was really working for that same kind of angle with the Roman Catholicism. And so for the main part, though, the way you would perceive it as being a cult is primarily because they had extremely conservative views and that they had this concept that only they were in possession of the truth.
Yes.
But there wasn't like any bizarre sacrifices or anything like that going on. It was just more kind of like a social control.
Yeah, social control. It was very patriarchal, very hierarchical. Even though they didn't have no one was paid. It was all like lay ministers. No one was paid. There was still this very deferential view to your elders, and particularly to men. So women weren't allowed to have any voice whatsoever. They weren't allowed to speak in public meetings at all. They had to wear only skirts and hats. And so there was that kind of clothing, rigid clothing kind of thing as well. I think for me, one of the things that actually, the reason why I say I think it's a cult is because I also found out and knew, I think, during my teens, but found out later, in my 20s, that there had been a bunch of men who'd been convicted sex offenders. So there was also that kind of layer on top, that not only just, from a messaging perspective, a language perspective, but there was actually like literal things going on where people were being used, sexually and oppressed. And I just think that's very troubling.
Right. So when did you start to have some questions about this then?
I questioned all the way through my teenage years.
Really?
Yeah, I think 11 was the first time I remember seeing a public meeting, and I was flicking through Isaiah the prophet and reading, because the sermon was pretty boring that day. And I just read about this God of justice who was for the marginalized and for the oppressed. And I was like, looking around my white middle class church that I kind of went to, that we used to commute out of my community. So the community I grew up in was extremely diverse. It was the most diverse community in Australia. So all the people around me were Lebanese, Eastern European, Vietnamese, very poor, very working class. But we used to kind of commute out of there to go to our sort of white middle class church with very little diversity. I think there was maybe one person of origin who was German, I think I remember. And I remember just flicking through Isaiah thinking, I just don't think that this whole defense of the truth, which was always like, we have to defend this truth, it has to be defended. I'm just like, I don't get that, because I feel like, for me, when I was looking through the pages of the Old Testament even, like there's this God of justice who cared about the widow, the orphan, the marginalized, the foreigner in your land, the stranger. So that was always, I think, and I'm an ENFP in Myers-Briggs, so that idea of the champion, like that spoke to me. Somehow we had, this God who was a champion for these people, and yet I didn't see us doing that. I saw us defending something else. So I think I've always had this slight divergent thing in my life where I've had my kind of faith journey has always been fairly private in some ways. When I was about 13 or 14, I had this, what I can only describe as a mystical experience. I probably wasn't sleeping very much at a youth conference. I think it was on the second last night of the youth conference, and I'd probably been all awake for the night before, but I remember sitting in this particular public meeting and kind of feeling like I saw the image of Jesus looking at Peter and seeing that image of betrayal in Jesus' eyes, and that kind of disappointment, that just cut me to the quick. And I was like, wow, I need to like do something with my life. And I came home and told my dad I want to be baptized. I didn't tell him. I actually wrote him a letter because I was too afraid to kind of say it to him. Wrote him a letter and slipped it under the door. And it took him a couple of days to respond to that letter. And when he did respond, he came in with a bunch of books and put them on my bed and was like, read these and we'll talk. And to me, that was like, that was a breaking point, because I was always the smart kid. I was like a total smart ass, but I would be like upside down, you know, in someone's car in the back of a church when we were doing the Sunday school exams, you know, jumping off the roof and still get a good mark. Like I knew the beliefs, like I knew all that stuff. Like they'd taught it to me. And so for me, when it was just like, hey, here's something else you need to learn, I was a bit like, fuck that. Am I allowed to swear in this place? Probably, hopefully.
No, you're good.
I was like, no, you taught me. Like, what's this next step? Like, I don't get it. Like, and because it felt to me very much like this authentic feeling that I had that I want to follow. And this idea of following Jesus was kind of very authentic to me at the time. So from that point onwards, I kind of like, you know, my teenage years were pretty screwed around, because I could realize, hey, I could live a hypocritical life. Like I could go to school, could have one girlfriend there and have a different life there, and then I could have my church life and keep them separately, because that was how my life was structured. And because it works like that, you could, you know, I wasn't allowed to go to school parties, wasn't allowed to go to school camps, but I could still have this life at school and this life at church. And so that was a period where I just kind of walked away a little bit in some ways, but I still was not allowed, you know, to stand up for myself. Wasn't allowed to not go to meetings. So, you know, I never really left church, but I think mentally, I think I left a lot.
So when you did physically leave, in spite of the fact that you knew you needed to break out, or that there had to be something maybe a little different, was there a sense of, did you feel like you kind of lost a little bit of your foundation or kind of your stability?
I don't think so. When I finally did leave that church, the church that I grew up in, I did go to another Christadelphian church, and it was, you know, at that point I'd kind of met a woman, met my ex, and I was very much on this search. You know, I think I'd found out basically what happened. The shorthand of that was, it's sort of funny how some of these things happen. So the shorthand was, was dating one of my best friends growing up, and so she was like, hey, we can't get engaged unless you actually do this whole baptism thing. Then I found out my dad was going to go and apply to be on the elder board, and so the thought of actually asking my dad again after that first rejection was like, no. Like, I need to get this done before he gets on the elder board. So I end up writing a letter to the elders and saying, hey, I want to be baptized, but I don't want to join that church, which I think for Christadelphians, it was like you were baptized and you became a member of that particular church. And I was like, I'm baptized into the Christadelphian faith, but I don't want to be a member of this church. I'm going to go and visit all of the Christadelphian churches in Sydney, because at that time I'd realised there was a whole bunch of them I didn't know. All these ones they talked about, these people who'd left the truth, I realised they were actually just worshipping at a different congregation around the corner. That was, you know, maybe a little more liberal or progressive. So, and then I broke up with that, my best friend, you know, because it was my sort of a childhood friend, met this new woman, found out that she was kind of, you know, at a more liberal kind of Christadelphian church, and that was kind of when I left that kind of felt like that, my family church from childhood, but that was like when I was 20. You know,
so it wasn't you just dropped everything, you just kind of shifted into something that was slightly less.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah,
Gotcha.
and for me, at that point, I don't think, because we never really were allowed to read any other literature from any other churches, you know, and there's all these things we weren't really allowed to do, so I never really had permission, I think, to explore. And when I sort of stepped outside that and started going to this more liberal Christadelphian church, then I started reading people. I started reading Rob Bell, and I started reading and listening to podcasts, you know. And that was when, you know, that sort of next shift kind of moved, where I was just like, actually, I think that there's something about like this Christadelphian faith, even the liberal side of it has a bunch of things that I think don't add up to me either.
So did you then ultimately move outside of Christadelphia altogether, or where are you at?
Yeah, so I when I moved to the States in 2011, landed in New York, part of the reason why I think that my ex would say we moved here was to try and get me out entirely, because even though I had a lot of questions and a lot of doubts, I was really devoted, you know, I was sort of brought up in a way, I was sort of a pastor's kid, like even though we didn't have like paid pastors, like my dad was a big guy in the movement, my grandfather was a big guy in the movement, and so I was just dedicating my life. I was volunteering. I believed that you're supposed to do something meaningful with your life, right? You know? And so I was volunteering and making records for free and doing a whole bunch of things. So when we moved to New York, part of that was to get out of this small pond, you know, and try and get out into kind of a wider circle and walk through the doors of an evangelical church there in New York. And within 3 weeks, they had me up on stage like leading worship, and then they asked me, you know, a few weeks after that to help plant a church in Brooklyn. So started this. I didn't really know anything about the evangelical church, you know. Wandered to America, and I was like, oh, cool. I like David Crowder Band, and I like Rob Bell, and how I found this church was churches like Rob Bell in New York City is what I actually Googled. But so, you know, kind of got into this evangelical church. Didn't take me very long to figure out, oh my goodness, there's a lot of issues here as well, you know, and figure out very quickly that the church in America is obsessed with consumerism. Just you know, was just so very quickly I was like, oh, this is not the answer either. But I was planning this church, and I told my boss, my pastor, when he hired me, I was like, hey, I have a lot of questions. Like my theology is changing rapidly. I don't know what I believe much, you know, I'm just kind of like, and he's like, great, we want to be the church that asks better questions. I'm like, I'm on board. So I did that, you know, for a while, and all the time I think for me, you know, then I began reading, you know, Catholics of all people, like Franciscans, you know, Richard Rohr, Brennan Manning. So for me, you know, finding kind of a lot of just a lot of meaning in these alcoholic Franciscans, mainly. That was like, what's the quote that is it? Brennan Manning is like an angel with a propensity for beer or something or other. Is that the quote? And I was like, man, I like that guy. But that was kind of where I shifted again when I, you know, was sort of having these kind of questions of like, well, I just don't think that the evangelical church has got it together either, and sort of, you know, in some ways I'm just like, this is actually a bigger evil than what I grew up with, because they hold the purse strings of America, you know, and the conversation in the evangelical church had moved into the religion and the politics rather, and I was just like, wow, that's incredible. You know? And this whole obsession with the separation of church and state, I'm like, I didn't see that as an outsider. I'm like, you all know that isn't separate, right? So yeah, I think these days I'm just kind of a mutt, really. I don't think I kind of fit anywhere particularly. I just don't think I identify with any particular one strand of theology, and kind of, for me, a lot of mystics make a lot of sense to me. You know, mindfulness has been a practice that has almost saved my life, quite literally, after I started having panic attacks, and that was a practice that kind of just was the only way I could find my way back into my body. So it's been quite the journey. You know, it was just every couple of years there's been something else that's kind of fallen over. I've had to kind of keep on moving. Right.
Well, I've had a different but similar story in the sense of really going through this huge evolution of thought and faith, and shifting from more conservative church context to more liberal to what probably most people would consider now completely outside. But it's been an interesting path. For me, it's been wanting to understand the truth of the thing, right? Not necessarily about religion, but about life. Like, what is it about? Because at one point you were talking about how we have to have meaning or purpose, some kind of vision. And so where does that come from, right? And the natural place where I think we look for that is in religion, because that claims to have the answer.
Right.
At least that's the direction I took. And it kind of took me on some roads that went deep and then kind of out. But I sense that there's a lot of people who are having questions. And I think it's like you mentioned before as well, there's so much out there that people have access to. It's very hard to keep somebody sheltered in a religious tradition. And as soon as you get exposed to the fact that there's other kinds of traditions out there, not just variations in the denomination, but wholly different religions, and even people who don't believe in any kind of religion, it makes it harder to be as confident about we're the ones, we've got the answer. And it's an interesting time, I think, for a lot of people.
Yep. I think there's a renewed interest, I think, honestly, in spirituality.
Yeah, and I think that spirituality is a good word too, because we hear a lot too that phrase spiritual but not religious.
Right.
Religion really isn't the bad word that people make it out to be, but I know what they mean by that, right? They're talking about kind of like this organized, structured thing that tends to be more focused on the past sometimes than the future.
Right.
But really, it just has to do with this idea of kind of binding, of trying to get back to that source.
Yep.
But spirituality is really expanded in ways I think are interesting, even into what we might say non-supernatural territory. So, like, I tend to come from what's philosophical naturalism, which is basically the position, and I wouldn't be like dogmatic about this position, but it's kind of like how I understand it at the moment, that what exists is just the natural world, that there is no supernatural world.
Right.
And I'm not saying no supernatural world in the sense that I absolutely reject it as a possibility, just that I don't find any evidence for it, right? But even within that naturalist worldview, there's the concept of spirituality.
Right.
Not in the sense of, again, supernatural, but in the sense that there is a connection to something larger than myself. And human nature requires kind of this connection in that way, that we have to have something that's beyond just us if we're going to have a sense of wholeness, of direction and purpose. And it's interesting that that exists for people who are non-religious.
Right.
Right? And it's not completely unheard of within the history of Christianity to have more of a naturalist perspective.
Not at all. Yeah.
Which it's just not very well received.
Right.
But it's fascinating how all that is working out. I know in my own life, and I can tell with your journey, you're definitely really wrestling with the questions.
Right.
Which I think is a big part of it. The journey is really so much of what it's about. It's not necessarily the destination.
That's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, one of the things you said earlier when you talked about religious and spiritual, I heard Brian Zahnd a few years ago in New York. It was actually amazing. We had this conference, but then this after-hours beer and theology event, which I know is close to your heart. And it was Brian Zahnd and Chris Green and Pete Enns.
Okay. Yeah.
And they were having this roundtable discussion, and it was as close as I think I've ever seen to white people, and particularly Christians, get to that idea of the Jewish idea of midrash, which is wrestling with the text. These they had beers in their hands, and these guys went at it. Like they weren't just like politely disagreeing the way we do in white culture. They were like full on arguing.
Yeah.
There was respect there, but they were like absolutely like no, and really kind of making their case, and I loved that. But one of the things that Brian Zahnd said in that particular setting, I'm pretty sure it was that night, but he said, it always annoyed him when people said, I'm spiritual, not religious. And he's just like, that's a privileged statement. He's like, religion is the thing that gives us kind of some clothing to the spiritual. It's a signpost towards the thing. And he says it's we can critique religion because we're given the tools to kind of basically like ask the questions about spirituality. And I was actually talking today to a friend and saying, what's fascinating to me is I think religion gives you these signposts, right, towards the spiritual, towards the source, as you said. But often for me in my deconstruction, those same signposts actually, as you step your way back, also kind of, they help you find your way out. As much as they help you find your way in, they help you find your way back out. Because for me, once I started realizing, the Bible's not this like perfect book, there's a lot of faults in it. It's it has errors. It's not inerrant. That once that kind of thing fell apart for me, then that was that one piece that was just stepping back down these breadcrumbs, these paths.
Yeah.
But I think to a certain degree, you asked kind of the question earlier, like, did I feel? You didn't use the word, but discombobulated in this journey. Did I feel like when I lost something?
Yeah.
I think to a certain degree, yes, but to a certain degree, I think because as those dominoes start to fall, there's something about that unraveling, that slow unraveling, that didn't feel surprising to me,
And maybe it's because it was more gradual.
Yeah.
Sometimes for people it happens suddenly.
Yes,
and,
that's right.
And it's like they're in midair.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think for me, the experience of what I've just been through in this last year, in the middle of my life, kind of these things falling apart, I think for a lot of people, they get to that point and they haven't asked some of those questions, and that's when it feels completely like, back to that, where is God? All this is bullshit. That's when those people, it all falls apart. I think for me, it has just been, I've always been a skeptic and a cynic,
Yeah.
so, that thing has just gradually unraveled. And I feel like that's kind of, there's something nice about that. I kind of feel like it's the emperor's clothing falling apart slowly, and the nakedness doesn't offend me. It doesn't surprise me.
Right.
And moreover, I think that's kind of the way it was supposed to be. I think that's how it was all along.
Yeah.
There was no one behind the curtain pulling the strings. It's just the way it is.
Yeah. Well, I know for me, one of the things that gradually started to emerge that became part of my struggle is that part of how any kind of faith or religious organization works is it almost by default kind of has to create a us versus them context.
Yes. Always.
Right? And part of it is this idea of the need of salvation, which means that things have to be bad.
Yeah.
So there's always looking for signs that things are getting worse.
Yeah.
And why we need salvation, why we need the truth that this group has. And that actually works really against so much that's happening in our world that's really positive.
Yeah.
And when I started to really be challenged on a lot of these areas where I was convinced, that things were just like the worst they'd ever been. Part of my faith tradition led me through a very strong nonviolent component. And so I really looked a lot at the issue of warfare and violence in general, and was convinced that, this is just horrible. And the social justice stuff brought me into a lot of questions about economics and how those function, and the issues of inequality and so forth. And I started being challenged that every single one of these categories is better than it has ever been before, and dramatically.
Yep.
In fact, every category you could think of trying to measure in terms of thinking about well-being, whether we're talking about education, the rights of women, homelessness, poverty, famine, war, violence. Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I mean, the graphs just go whoop, and you're like, how was I convinced that it was so horrible?
Right.
And part of it is our lifespan is pretty narrow. So from our perspective, when something bad happens, or it's not to say there isn't anything going on that's wrong. There's certainly tons of problems. It's not like we live in utopia. But we can sometimes, by emphasizing all that negativity, get to this point where we feel like, we're helpless.
Yeah.
And this is part of, I think, where the religion part comes in sometimes, is like, well, we've got the answer.
Yeah.
It's not us. It's something outside of us. And when I started to see this bigger picture, I realized, man, in some respects, that religious perspective is really counterproductive. It blinds us to where we have made progress. And when we see that progress, that can give us a position of strength to work from to hit the real challenges that we have.
Yep.
So that was kind of a big shifting point for me, as well as my background with biblical studies. Like my journey, I've talked about it in an earlier kind of a monologue that I did for the show one time. But, it led me through going back to school and getting my master's of divinity and focusing on biblical studies. And for me, I had a heavy emphasis on cultural anthropology and how that played out. And so it led to all sorts of insights into the nature of the biblical text. And like you said, the concept of inerrancy doesn't really hold up. And you start to see all these pieces that open up more and more questions about how does this even work, and how did they understand it, and how did it get transmitted, and how has all this stuff kind of actually continuously evolved to the point where I hope that what we're seeing is the next step in that kind of evolution.
Yep.
Right, of where we seem to be, for the most part, comfortable with the fact that the earth is not flat. There's not a dome overhead holding in the sun, moon, and stars.
Yeah.
Right? We survived that scientific understanding, even though it was a struggle. And even though there's a resurgence of flat earthers on YouTube. But maybe the next part's going to happen, right? I mean, there's been changes in terms of the ability for women to speak in church, some churches, maybe not the one you grew up in. And of course, slavery has kind of gone out the window for most people as well. Big question again about, gays and how that fits into the whole picture. So
Right.
it's going to be interesting to see, where it goes. I don't know.
Yeah, I think for me, I definitely grew up in this idea that everything had to get worse before it got better, right?
Yeah.
End times theology in any church environment basically says things going to get heavy before we then get swept up and someone comes in to save us. This idea you have to be saved from something and saved to something. And once you start asking those questions, I think that's where a lot of people kind of wind up in deconstruction. Because it's like, what am I being saved from, or what am I being saved to?
Yeah.
And for me, one of the things that I struggle with conservative Christianity is this idea that somehow that were really not so much in America, because I think America did, a lot of evangelicals definitely believe that Trump is Jesus, like that he's going to save us. I think for the community I grew up in, they were rejoicing when Trump was elected because they thought he's going to bring about the next world war, and then Jesus is going to come back. Like, they were rejoicing that things were going to get hard and bad. And I'm just like, I think for me, the reason why I'm a progressive is that exactly what you just said. I do believe that the world is much more peaceful than ever was before. I do believe that there's been huge strides moved forward in a variety of areas, and I'm definitely not an anti-vaxxer. I like this idea that hey, we actually got rid of a bunch of diseases. We actually helped, and the fact that herd immunity is a thing. So we should keep these things in place because for the betterment of the species, and not just betterment of us, but other people. So that's why I'm very staunchly progressive. I think we are moving forward. I think that's good news. I think that's kind of the good news of what gospel is that we're moving towards the long arc of justice. Just it goes that bends towards justice. Like it's long. We have to do the fight. We have to do the thing now for the next generation, of the generation after that. Like, I think we're in a climate emergency. I think we need to be doing that work now.
Yeah.
For the next couple of generations, so I think that's what we're called to do as people of faith, is to look at these things and like, how can I just leave this world a little bit better for the next person?
Yeah. Well, and I think that another thing that's interesting to look at too, from like a sociological perspective, is that when we're talking about religion, we're talking about a worldview that prescribes vice and virtue, what the ideal is, what you should be doing, what you shouldn't be doing, all that kind of stuff.
Yep.
But every perspective, even if it doesn't call itself a religion, essentially does the same thing.
Yep.
So even secular stuff is, in a sense, a religion.
Yep.
Because the foundations or the tenets, like even if we take like American, if you will, theology, right? Founded on the Declaration of Independence with, foundational statements like, the inalienable rights.
Yep.
Well, what is that?
Yeah.
It's not a thing.
Right.
It's not objective. You can't point to it. You can't measure it. It's an idea.
Yep. Absolutely.
And so and so much of our culture is made up of those kinds of things, right? What we might call myths in other contexts.
Yep.
Common example is corporations. What is a corporation? It's not a thing, right?
Yeah.
It's a construction, a social construction of something. So it's really interesting when we see how this religion, state type stuff works. It's like it's all dealing with essentially the same kind of stuff in a kind of a gross sense, ideology.
Yeah.
But we're seeing kind of the challenge, the clash of these different worldviews colliding with each other. One that sees the more idyllic in the past, one sees the more idyllic in yet to come.
Yep.
And so that's kind of an interesting, how are these going to match up?
Yep.
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot of fear where those things, those conflicts occurs, where those kind of we rub up against those ideas. That's where the fear occurs. Like, we're about to hit July 4, and this idea that this country is free, everybody is free, is a tension, right? It's a tension that exists right now because we abolished slavery, and so we think we're done with the race conversation, but we're still a long way from those conversations being a real thing. We still actually haven't. There's still legislation that we have not signed that is very easy to sign that actually gives the freedom and right to all individuals that there still has been sitting there for 30, 40 years. And even not just on the race conversation, just gender itself. Women still actually have not got that. There's still legislation sitting there that has not been signed.
The ERA is still not existent.
That's incredible. Some people are like, well, we fixed that. I'm just like, we had a black president. I'm just like, did we though? I mean, there's a lot to go. And I think, there's that ideology of that, like, well, I'm free. I'm in America. I'm proud to be American. At least I know I'm free. I'm like, well, on the other side of that, I would say, well, no one's free until we're all free. And I don't think that, in my observation as an outsider, that the African American is free today. Yeah. The way in the way that you and I are free. Even for me as an immigrant, as a white man in America with my privilege, that the same privilege is not afforded to our folks of color in this country.
Yeah, and we can't move forward ignoring the past.
Yeah.
Right? We want to have a really serious amnesia about everything. Well, that was yesterday.
Yeah.
And that's not functional. We have to have that memory. We have to understand because it has implications.
Uh-huh.
And even the concept of freedom is pretty interesting.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, to what degree could anybody ultimately be free, right? Because everything's connected.
Yes.
Everything we do impacts somebody else. There's no way for it not to be the case. Everything we have is because of what other people have done. There is no truly autonomous anybody. Nobody actually made themselves.
Yeah, that's right.
So I wonder sometimes if that's even the right conversation to be having.
Right.
I mean, I understand the direction, and I think that there's this idea that there are amounts of autonomy that we need to be having in order to feel, again, experiencing this idea of being authentically human and having the ability to affect things is super important for us in our sense of wholeness. But that has to be tied in with the fact that, it's all connected.
Yeah.
And that means it comes with obligations as well.
Yep. I love that idea of oneness. I feel like that's been a thing that I think has been talked about a lot recently in spirituality. The fact that we're just bound together. Yeah, our kind of our destiny as humanity is we're all bound together.
Yeah.
And that idea of that none of us are free unless we're all free. Like I think one thing that is just so obvious to me that's happened in the last couple of years is Brexit. This idea that we can just go back to making Britain great again. It was the same argument as here in America. And I'm like, can you though? Because I think that decision for them to exit out the European Union is going to have massive ripple effects on economies worldwide. I think it's already kind of having a huge impact on kind of there between Europe and Britain. It's already having a massive kind of issue. And that idea that somehow we can just, and I have my objections to globalization. I think there are some big issues with that. But I think that somehow we can undo some of these things. It seems really immature to me. Because what we got given because of this conversation is also huge, and the world is expansive in ways that we've never done before. And I think one of the reasons why I think people get on this doom and gloom stuff is because it is overwhelming, because in our pockets now we have this machine that tells us every tragedy that's ever happening right at the moment, and it just feels overwhelming.
Yeah.
But to actually see that and to go, well, that knowledge is power. You can make these changes. We can actually kind of that kind of the instant we feel that empathy towards something that's happening there, we can actually do something about it. We can kind of actually put our feet into action. And I think that too much times, I think in the West, our privilege means we can just feel sad about these things and feel bad about them and hold white guilt over these things, rather than actually walking into action as people of faith and walking into hard places and hard spaces, hard conversations, hard legislation, like all those. We try to avoid those hard things and get around them, as if they're not places to go through into kind of the better, more expansive future.
Yeah. Well, it's hard when you're on the receiving end of the good stuff, right? Because that means you're putting things at jeopardy in order to go after some of those causes, and that's always the challenge, right?
Yep.
So I'd like to stop for a moment because it's been kind of heavy, and we're going to wonder if you'd like to play us another song.
Sure.
Right on.
I looked into my heart and saw darkness, a deep and ancient chill within my bones. Ever since the envy that spilled a brother's blood, we're all dying to throw stones. But from St. Louis springs a riot for all of the kids not coming home. And I see a struggle that binds us all tonight, marches the streets to atone. Mama, I'm having those bad dreams again, where the wicked don't pay for what they done. Mama, the evil that dwells in hearts of men, no peace or justice under the sun. Cold November's afternoon in Cleveland, child and his cheap plastic gun. Only 3:30 and they left him there to bleed, too young to learn, he didn't have time to run. Mama, I'm having those bad dreams again, where the wicked don't pay for what they done. Mama, the evil that dwells in hearts of men, no peace or justice under the gun. Father of 6 in New York City, selling cigarettes out in the street, dying in daylight for all of us to see. I can't breathe, 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 I can't breathe. Mama, I'm having those bad dreams again, where the wicked don't pay for what they done. Mama, the evil that dwells in hearts of men, no peace or justice under the sun. No peace or justice under the sun.
Again, just amazingly beautiful. Is this another original song?
Yeah, I got all the originals tonight.
Okay. And what is this one called?
A song called Mama.
Okay.
I wrote it coming up to 5 years ago, I think, if my timeline is right in my head. It was the night the decision came back to not indict the police officer who killed Mike Brown in Ferguson, Missouri. I remember waking up that particular day and hearing the news and just not being able to get out of bed, just feeling the weight of this is something that happened very publicly. We all saw this thing and had a lot of opinions about it, but just this idea that somehow that justice couldn't be served was really weighed heavy on me. So I started writing the song, and as kind of the song itself has this progression because it looks inwardly first and kind of says like in each of us in our humanity there exists this kind of like weird, vengeful, dark side, that kind of right from the story of Cain and Abel, which is kind of referenced there in that first verse, that we've always had this competitive nature with other people, and sometimes the darkness kind of drives us to these places of conflict. So I had the first verse and the chorus, which is just a lament saying, Mama, I'm having these bad dreams again, which which I think in two things can either be Mother Earth. We're kind of talking to Mother Earth and saying, here we're destroying your children, or we're talking to the Divine Mother, or just even to the natural mother who's mourning that loss. So I had those first two things, and then I kind of went to a collaborator's place to write the rest. And as we were doing that, I found out that people were marching from Times Square into Brooklyn, over the Brooklyn Bridge. They actually shut down the bridge. And this started happening, of course, all over the country, that people took to the streets and marched. And for me, that gave hope that we would see some change, that people were saying enough's enough, that we're kind of this conversation needs to move forward. We need to have a more accountability amongst the people in power. And so yeah, here we are, many years later, and we're still unfortunately seeing the same thing. Time after time, when a black guy gets shot by cops, we're not seeing those indictments are not happening. We're still still wrestling with what does that system look like. And just recently, obviously, one of our presidential candidates, Pete Buttigieg, in his hometown, the same thing happened, and the body camera is not on, and the dash cam was also not on. And so I think these are big questions. Like, how do we actually, politics is basically just how do we organize ourselves as humans, right?
Yeah.
So how do we actually keep these structures in place to make sure that people are coming home alive, and that's cops and other people, to protect all people, because life matters. Like that our existence on Earth is sacred and profound and beautiful, and how do we kind of prevent these tragedies from occurring time and time again? And what are the structures in place, the systematic structures that kind of really oppress folks of color particularly? And so, yeah, here we are. That's that's kind of where that song comes from, and for me is about that same thing. That I think for me, when these things occur, that I grieve just as much as the communities that are grieving the person that's not coming home. And I think other people should, and it might make us uncomfortable, and that's okay.
Yeah.
The uncomfortable nature of grief, and the uncomfortable nature of saying, here's this issue that's happening over and over again, is not something to be avoided, it's something to learn from, I think.
Yeah, and I think we're obviously trying, hopefully, to work out how do we make the systemic changes that need to happen. The more we understand about, again, human nature and what it's like to be in those situations as police officers, because that's a whole nother aspect that sometimes we hold people up to unnatural expectations about what happens when that adrenaline gets going and everything else, in terms of being able to make decisions and that kind of thing. So how can we structure things differently to change that? And I know it's not moving near as fast as anybody would like, but I am encouraged by the amount of public concern and outrage. That in itself, even though it's small, is big, because that means that the hardest part with any kind of social change is being able to perceive of things being different, to capture that imagination. And I bring this up often on the show about the importance of the arts and music to operate in that space, to create those images and help us experience and see and perceive things from different angles, that I think helps us to have that compassion and that concern about what needs to change and what it could look like. So I'm hoping that those are signs that we're moving in the right direction.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think I'm very much with you on the same page about, for me as an artist, my entire life, there are a few things that I think united me with other artists, which is our ability to question things. That's what I think the role of art does, to hold up a mirror. And then I think also to try and, I agree with you, the kind of the transforming nature of art, that I think that kind of can always, not always, but can fall into a prophetic kind of vein to say, like, there is a better day, there is a brighter day out there, that it's not all entirely hopeless. To dream up a world that may not yet exist, to dream that into existence, the classic imagine, John Lennon, imagine there's no heaven. I think for me, one of the things that I've kind of realized as I've walked through my life as an artist as well, and walked through communities of faith particularly, is I think I can't speak for a lot of faith communities aside from Christianity, is I feel like we've lost ability to lament. I feel like that's gone astray a little bit. I think that we've sort of got this, Christus Victor Christ the Savior, won, overcame the grave, life is good, looking forward to the next big thing. And what was profound for a few years ago, as I was learning a bit more about the Catholic faith, was learning there's actually two crucifixes, because there's the crucifix that has no body, no corpse on it, which is that story, is the Christus Victor, is the victorious Christ who's rose from the grave and overcome all things. But in a lot of, particularly in poor communities and minority communities, the crucifix that is displayed is the one with the corpse, the Corpus Christi, with the body still hanging on the cross. And for a lot of these communities who are particularly who are oppressed or marginalised, that the reason why that has meaning to them as a meaning marker is because this is a Christ who died and suffered with us in our humanity.
Yeah.
And I think that idea to me is just magic, that I think that we need to have an imagination in our communities of faith about suffering, because it's not something to be escaped out of. It actually might be your biggest teacher. Suffering might actually be the thing that is forming and shaping you. That it's not, it might destroy you, but in my kind of idea that the death and resurrection, they go hand in hand. Like, that God is not as concerned with you dying, because whatever the thing is next, the resurrection, the next bit that comes next, is the thing that you'll rise to or evolve to or move into. And I think that, to me, is what I think the deconstruction journey is about, right? You died out an idea kind of falls away, but then something else comes after that gives you some sort of comfort, gives you some sort of clarity, some sort of peace. So for me, this mama song, this lament, this kind of cry into this, wow, this there's no peace and justice under the sun, feels bleak. Yeah. But for me, it actually is kind of that howl that we kind of, I think Nick Cave, one of my great favourite Aussie artists and a great artist, kind of talks about how lament is like the cry into the void of the lunatic supplicant, looking for God. And that we actually have to throw these things out there sometimes, saying, where are you? Why did this happen? In order to kind of let the truth that life is beautiful and sacred, but also kind of brutal and kind of unsettling at times, kind of settle down into us. And those two things, beauty and pain, sit alongside each other. That you can't have one without the other. For me, my teenage self, John Keats, was my man, in poetry. And when he has these ode to melancholy, and it's just even in the Temple of Delight, melancholy has a shrine. These two things go hand in hand. You can't have one without the other. That idea of oneness. There's these binaries which we want to kind of say good and evil, or black and white. The goodies and the baddies. Those don't really exist. The world is very grey. And we can experience both our best days and our worst days in the same moment.
Yeah. I wonder, and this is just kind of occurring to me as you're talking, if part of, within faith communities, you're talking about, you're sensing this failure to embrace the power of lament. I wonder if there's something about the encroachment of patriotism into the faith tradition that makes it harder for people to acknowledge when something's gone wrong. Because there's kind of this, sometimes I think there's this thing where that kind of stops us from being able to admit or recognize or acknowledge something like that. I don't know. It just kind of popped in my head a little bit as you were talking.
Yeah, to me, the two things that connect with that is, this idea of making America great again. And I'm like, if we rewind America wasn't great for a lot of people. America not that long ago was extremely oppressive of women and black folks. It wasn't great for them back then. So where were we taking it back to? Where did you find it was great? Because I think, out of what we were talking about, progressive kind of natures, it has moved along. America is as great as it has been. And that kind of reminds me of that first scene of Newsroom. I don't think you've ever seen that, where he's asked kind of that question, and he said, no, America's not the best country in the world, and lists off a bunch of things. And I think this idea that patriotism is kind of in bed with religion is unsettling to me a little bit, and yet at the same time, the kind of the central book that Christians kind of talk about, the Bible, is a book written by Jews. So it's the Jewish culture. It's not our culture. For starters, I think some people think that it is. They've sort of Christianize the Bible, but that's kind of wasn't our story. That was the story of the Jews, and for much of that book, they're the oppressed people group.
Yeah.
They're the people trying to get out from under the empire. So it's my observation a little bit that America as a Christian nation, where it's at right now as of 2019, is this: the church has a lot of power here.
Mm-hmm.
So the church, the American church in 2019 looks more like the Roman church of the first century that Jesus came to talk against. You know?
Yeah, I've often gone through this kind of discussion with people. You know, if we want to map the characters of the Bible to today,
Mm-hmm.
you know, we're not the Jesus people.
No.
The Jesus people would be the displaced immigrant seasonal workers that we
Yeah.
have here in Southern California.
Yeah.
And we would be Rome.
Yeah, that's right.
Right, and so it really, we've got this like social location problem of how we're interpreting the story and perceiving it, and a lot of challenges with just taking it too straightforward without really thinking through what does it mean, where did it come from.
Yeah, absolutely. I had this profound experience in December. So this is the first time I visited San Diego, mid-December of 2018. And it was 2 weeks after the kids had been tear-gassed at the border in Tijuana. And so I crossed into Mexico for the afternoon and went down to the beach to have some lunch and kind of to come back. I was in there for a couple of hours. But I honestly could not believe it when I crossed the border. So San Diego is a pretty wealthy place, pretty well-to-do. And once I crossed that border into Tijuana, I just was speechless for about 40 minutes because I've done a lot of travel in my life, but most of that has been through major metropolitan cities, so Paris, London, Tokyo, you know, those kind of places, which are largely, you know, it's largely the West. I'd never really been to, you know, for me, what felt like a third world country. Like Tijuana is rough. It's just slums built on hillsides. And I just was speechless because that story of the kids being tear-gassed at the border was sitting right on top of what we're looking at in Advent, of this story of Jesus who was born into an oppressive regime and had to flee to Egypt, to a different country to escape. And then we sat in the border to come back into America. We sat at the border for 4 hours because the traffic was crazy. It was between Christmas and New Year. And just hundreds and hundreds of people streaming between cars because you basically have a parking lot. You're sitting there and people come trying to sell you big plastic Jesuses and beads and whatever they want to think. And for me, I just found myself, I actually had a panic attack. Because I found myself in this just like, wow, this story sat on me so heavy that this was the experience. This is a very disconcerting experience. This story is not cute. The Christmas story wasn't like this sentimental thing anymore. It was profoundly political.
Yeah.
That kind of Jesus having to escape, the slaughter of the innocents
Political
refugee, seeing somewhere else, and at some point would have to come back into his homeland and walk through this like very disconcerting experience of having to come back through over the borders. It really just hit me that I feel like we have located ourselves wrong in the story, you know, and that has there's many layers there that are deep and they're often uncomfortable. They're not. Yeah. These stories, I think, when you grow up with them, they just become Sunday school stories. They become these like myths that feel comfortable and kind of. Yeah. Soothing even, like the parables of Jesus, these like cool stories he told, instead of like these really disturbing things about power and these disturbing stories that like upset the world up the other way around, like, you know, the way you perceive it's not the way it should be. Like
yeah, absolutely. There's a lot of just absolutely shocking, jarring material we could look at, and why even as a naturalist I still am moved by the resources that are available to us in the Hebrew and Christian scriptures, because they speak to so many of the similar issues, that they're still just amazingly powerful, I think. I look at them a bit differently, but I still find a lot of resources there. I want to come back to something you mentioned way at the beginning, because I think this might be a good time to touch on it. You talked about the importance of mindfulness. for you. And you mentioned on your way back from Tijuana kind of having a little bit of a panic or anxiety attack, and that you said mindfulness has been very powerful for you in being able to know how to manage those things.
Yep.
I also am a big fan and proponent of mindfulness, but I'd love to hear kind of your experience with that and your story with, how did you find yourself there?
Yeah, so I started about 3 years ago, I think it was, started having a series of chronic panic attacks. Most of it was usually in transportation, so in a bus or a train or a car, and most of it was trying to come back into New York City. Like every time I was trying to get back into New York City, it was like my body didn't want to be there, didn't want to go there. And so I had a panic attack, I remember at the airport in Indianapolis with my entire staff at church. We were actually having a staff meeting, and I had to get out and lie down on the tile because I just was my experience of panic attacks, my particular, the way it happens for me is very dissociative, and so I feel my spirit or my sense of self lift out of my body, and I can often kind of be looking at myself almost from an exterior. So it's kind of this feeling of where just this bodily experience, I just don't feel like I'm there anymore. I feel like I'm floating away. It's horrific. Kind of feels. It also is very painful. Like it feels like I'm sort of dying and having a heart attack. So for me, one of the things that first, well, it wasn't the first one, but I think particularly that Indianapolis attack, I was lying on the tile in Indianapolis airport going, I need to somehow do something to bring me back home to myself. This is kind of where we started with this kind of thought.
Yeah.
How to get myself back into my body, how to come back in here. And so I was like, okay, words have always been my thing. I'm a songwriter. That should be no surprise, and so words are the thing I love. And I was like, okay, just find something that recite something like Psalm 23 or something that you've known your entire life. Couldn't do it. The words just didn't know where they were coming from. It was like Psalm 23 also got mixed up with another psalm, and it was just completely discombobulated. It's like, all right, we'll recite the Lord's Prayer. Same thing. These are things I've known since I was this high, and yet they couldn't come to me. Words were useless to me in this situation, the panic attack. And so it was through some advice, it was my ex-partner, through my therapist, through other people who basically just I had to get back in touch with my body. And this was where I realized that my experience of church, my experience of faith, was all about just trying to get this thing right.
Yeah.
Right? Just get your belief right. So it's only ideas, it's only words, and words are a construct, in themselves. And so for me, I had this very divorced experience in my spirituality between what happened up here and what happened here.
Yeah.
And what actually I've come to understand through therapy is that I was ignoring all the signs my body was giving me that I was in trauma, that I had a lot of repressed things I was actually dealing with. And so I had to kind of figure out a way to get back into my body. And basically the advice I was given was, when the panic attack was happening, was go back to the things you can hear, smell, touch, feel. Go back to your senses, the most basic things given to us, building blocks.
Yeah.
Go back to the things that are concrete and true in that moment, because everything else, my mind starts playing tricks on me. Nothing is true, nothing is real. This experience of life is existential, and so I start to panic, and it all starts to fly out of me. So I think getting back to those kind of groundings and that kind of feeling of what's in my body, what's my body telling me today, and that's been my practice since, is trying to kind of through acupuncture or through yoga, through meditation, through just physical fitness, running, is just trying to get back into this body that I got given, this beautiful body I got given, instead of, I think, unfortunately, thinking about the body as a place to, so Ken Robinson in his TED Talk talks about the body being a way to get our mind to things, that this is just a way to transport my mind around so my mind can do the important work. My body is actually not important. And I think a lot of that is very much bound up in the early, first century Christian debate, the Gnostic era, that basically your body doesn't matter, your spirit is what matters, and so it doesn't matter. Either it doesn't matter what your body does, that's one way to go, or you have to repress all the things your body does, because it's corrupt, and what's native or natural, right, is wrong. But what's spiritual is what matters. And very much to me, what I've found is this coming home to myself has involved just coming home to my body, learning what it feels like, what I enjoy.
Yeah.
Learning to not just use food for the sake of satiating hunger, but using that for pleasure and enjoying that and slowing down while I eat. And like, I'm a big beer guy or a whiskey guy, and enjoying those things. They're there to be enjoyed. That's a symbol of love that exists in our world.
Yeah.
So I think it feels more simplistic than I think kind of my faith used to be. It feels a little bit more tangible and natural, and it feels a little bit more like trying to be present in the moment rather than being either caught up in the past or running to the future in my mind, but being in my breath and being here in the moment.
Yeah. It's really amazing how much it can transform your whole perspective on everything. And the idea of being present is huge, because we can miss so much of what's going on because of our concerns about the future or our fears about the past, and not actually experiencing what's going on. And learning how to kind of pause, recognize those thoughts and evaluate them rather than just reacting can break that cycle, because that's the thing that would happen for me is I get caught in a cycle, right? And so finding that way to interrupt it has been huge. But also, it just transforms your experience of life. Because you're aware of so many more things than you were before, and the beauty that's going on, and the good times, as well as the things that aren't so good. But you become more aware of them, and you can take the time to incorporate more of those good, make them last, make them stick, as opposed to just these fleeting moments.
One of the big things I've had a huge epiphany around that, what you just said, was that I think as adults we start to numb things out a little bit, right? We have no idea of what an adult means. We have this term now, like adulting. I'm adulting so hard today, and a lot of that, I think, when you look at just that hashtag or look at that kind of thing, it's about like paying bills and doing the grind, and this idea that your life is just to be endured. We need to survive rather than thrive. So for me, one of the things I've actually had an epiphany around is that I was a very, very emotional teenager, very expressive, and write poetry and a whole thing. And all the people who knew me back then still have that image of me as this very passionate, kind of very volatile kind of person. But then I thought, like this idea that somehow, and being told obviously as well by the cult and by Christianity, is like, we got to be an adult, we got to be responsible, do all these things. I think that what I've recently been realizing as I've been coming home to myself, as I've been doing my work, as I've been kind of getting more mindful, as I've been working through therapy, is I'm actually experiencing all of these emotions again. Not that they went entirely away, but I felt like for 20 years of my life I numbed myself out a little bit, and I'm finding myself like way more like I'm a crybaby. Every Disney movie is just like, I just love that. But I just think there's something about my experience which is so much deeper and richer. And I feel like, I was saying to my therapist the other day, there's a softness and gentleness inside myself that I've just never experienced before. As I kind of find myself trying to find, the present moment. And that's contrasted, which I think this part of myself which is still, kind of angry and fearful, and those old scripts are still part of my experience. But I'm learning how to have empathy and compassion towards myself in those moments, realizing that might just be the child that I'm wrestling with inside, who's afraid that these things aren't kind of real, and that's where my panic comes from, is when this split starts to happen in myself. And so I think for me, as I've been doing this personal transformation, I've also seen what I think is true, I think on a larger scale, is that when we're so fearful of the other, and when we have this scarcity mentality, and when our tribal kind of stuff comes up and we have to like push someone else away over there, that all of that can be broken down by compassion and empathy for the other person. All that can be broken down by us actually saying, no, there's room enough at the table. Like, there's room for everybody here. There's enough resources to go around. Like, that I think what can happen for you personally is also how we kind of also look at the larger picture, how we might be able to solve is a bad word, but how we might be able to find more peace nationally and globally around these things, how we might be able to find room for people at the border who we don't think there's room for, how we might be able to kind of look at that whole situation differently, is finding empathy and compassion towards the thing we're most afraid of, and the thing that gives us fear, and the thing that gives us anxiety.
Yeah. Well, and that's, I think, one of the first key things is having that compassion that comes from that perspective of being able to see from other people's vantage points.
Yep.
That's kind of the beginning of everything.
Yep.
Yeah.
I think a lot of that for me, my process has been very much trying to find that compassion for myself first.
Mm-hmm.
I think even the great, commandment, right, to love the Lord your God, your whole heart, soul, mind, strength, but love your neighbor as yourself. I think, sometimes it's true we are loving our neighbor as ourselves. It just happens that we actually hate ourselves, And I think to actually do that transformative work, to actually, to learn that compassion for yourself, that you might be give that compassion to somebody else. Because I think sometimes we're giving people charity, which may not actually be compassion, empathy. It may be something else entirely. It might be toxic.
Yeah. Might just be enabling a system that's broken.
That's right.
Yeah. So I think that's good. We've kind of come back around to this idea of coming home to ourselves. I know that one of the things that's been part of my experience too, as somebody who has been concerned about all sorts of social global type issues, that it's interesting how much of it also comes back to us. Mm-hmm. That we have to do a lot to work at how we are engaging and perceiving things and experience things, and that's a very large part of that component. Right. I don't know what the balance is between the two in terms of working for change and how we're working on ourselves, but I definitely have come to see that I need to spend more on myself than I had in the past. I was kind of the one that was left out and everything. Everybody else came first.
Yep.
So that's been kind of an interesting shift. Well, it's just been an amazing conversation. Can I get you to do one more song to close us out?
Absolutely.
Okay, I appreciate that.
This is my part of the story, and I'm sticking to this tune. It may not seem to you like fact, but for me it is the truth. I've wrestled long and hard with all the pieces and the parts, wound up with this bleeding broken heart. And I wish that I had known this from the start. Did you ever really give a damn? Did you even care? Was there curiosity for all the burdens that I bear? Do you ever stop to wonder? Does it even cross your mind that I have done the best I could 1,000 times? This is my part of the damage. Yes, I'm owning all my shame. The sticks and stones that broke my bones had nothing on the names. And I've been called all kinds of things from the pulpit and my kin, till somehow I believed I'd never win. In this endless strife and struggle with my sin, did they ever really give a damn? Did they even care? Too busy trying to save my soul with all their thoughts and prayers. Did they ever stop to notice? Did they walk on by and leave me lying in that ditch 1,000 times? So I'm looking in the mirror. What's this face I see? I hardly recognize myself, this man I want to be. I'm tired of the masquerade, my part in the game. Surely there must be a better way. So I'm learning to be naked and unafraid. Yeah, I'm trying not to give a damn, give in to the despair. I'm starting to protect my heart and treat it with some care. Oh, why do you ever listen to these broken, hateful lies when love is whispered in my ear 1,000 times?
Wow, Ben. Another great song.
Thank you.
And so you said these are all originals.
Yep.
So what is this one called?
It's called 1,000 Times.
1,000 Times. And what's this one about then?
Yeah, this is kind of what we were just talking about before the break, that really for me, that I learned this self-loathing, this self-hatred through the other voices that came to me. The voices of my, one of the lines from the pulpit and my kin, from the church and from family, learned kind of the feelings of worthlessness and feelings that I was not worthy of love, or feeling of being less than. But realizing that all down that journey, as I slowed down in the last little while and started looking at myself in the mirror and realizing that same self-loathing was coming back at me, that I could speak bad words about myself, that realizing that as I've been unraveling that love has been there the whole time, whispering at us. And so I think for me, the idea of mindfulness, of coming back to the present moment and coming back to myself, is realizing that there's slowing down enough to hear that still small voice that's saying you're loved, like you belong, and that's for everybody, that's not just for me, is a place of healing and a place where I'm finding home again.
Wow, what a great way to end the show. Thank you so much for coming. I'm hoping we'll have a chance to get you back again sometime.
Fantastic. Thank you for having me. I really appreciate it.
Oh, my pleasure. All right, everyone, be well.